And Russia says Ukraine targeted Moscow late on Sunday night with more than 400 drones, the latest in a series of deep strikes inside Russian territory. Russian air defences intercepted most of the drones, but some made it through, hitting their targets and wounding at least 10 people. The attack started a fire at an industrial park in the Domodedovo area, which is also home to one of the city's airports. The aerial assault came hours after a massive Russian bombardment of Ukrainian cities, including Kramatorsk. At least 5 people died, 2 of them in attacks on the capital, Kyiv. The Kennan Institute's a Washington-based centre for advanced research on the countries of the former Soviet Union. Michael Kimmage is its director. He's also a professor of history at the Catholic University of America and has advised on Russia and Ukraine from within the US State Department. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to DW. Can we start with these latest Ukrainian attacks on Russian targets? Tell us what you make of the significance of the Russian targets that Ukraine has been hitting and what that tells you about what Ukraine is now trying to achieve.
I think 2 things, really. One is to make the war more difficult to prosecute on a macro level for Russia. So oil refineries, transit hubs, the basic infrastructure of the Russian economy that's underpinning the war effort. But the other aspect of these attacks is indeed more psychological, that they have taken place, several of them in Moscow, that they are, in a sense, creeping closer to civilian and normal life, although Ukraine is not targeting Russian civilians. And so a message is being sent to the Russian people that the war is far less distant than they would want it to be.
And how does that help Ukraine, given that Russia is so tightly controlled by President Putin? The fact that people in the street feel the war coming closer, well, why does Putin care?
Putin may not care, although I'm sure behind the scenes he does. But even in dictatorial regimes, which is what Russia has, there is a relationship between population and government. And for years now, the government has said that victory is around the corner. And I think Ukraine is demonstrating something very vivid, something very palpable on the streets of Russia, which is not only that Russia is not winning, but in some ways Russia is failing to defend the Russian homeland. So there is a strong political message in that. Putin is going to vehemently disagree, to be sure, but the loyalty of his population is not ensured. And this is a Ukrainian attempt to make use of that.
Is this the best that Russia can manage? Yes, we had the initial miscalculation that Russian forces would overwhelm Ukraine before they realised what had happened. But in the 4 years since then, what has stopped the Ukraine from just throwing more men and military machines at the job?
Well, I think that Ukraine has done that on the front lines, but those have stagnated really on both sides of the conflict. But due to technological innovation, Ukraine is really able to change the war quite dramatically within Russia at relatively low cost and in ways that Ukraine can continue innovating about. So the war has changed fundamentally in the last couple of months and very much to Ukraine's advantage.
But is this not a war that Russia could just mobilise millions more personnel and just send more tanks and ammunition into the front line? I think people are sort of looking at this, we who are not deeply involved, and we just ask ourselves, well, why is this taking what we thought was such a major military power? Why is it taking Russia so long to get this job done?
A combination of factors. One is the very strategic concept of the war itself, which was unrealistic to begin with. Another is poor military decision-making, corruption, mismanagement at the front on the Russian side, which has rendered Russia less effective. And the other factor at work is politics in Russia once again, whereas Putin could mobilize half the society and throw it at the war, but that's very much not what Russians want. And so the initial promise of the war is, we will win, the Kremlin was saying, in short order, with low cost and low sacrifice to the Russian people. And I think the Kremlin has been reluctant to move away, at least from that message, although the reality of the war has moved on dramatically. So Putin finds himself in the place where his deceptions, self-deceptions, and deceptions of the Russian population, he finds himself in the place where those deceptions have landed him.
Talk about politics in Ukraine. There have been public demonstrations in Ukraine against the sacking of a very popular defence minister, Mykhailo Fedorov. Now crowds are calling for the resignation of Fedorov's former boss, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky. What does this tell us about what's going on at the top of the Ukrainian defence establishment?
I would actually go to the top of the Ukrainian government first. You have martial law in the country over the last 4 years, and so there have not been elections in Ukraine. So one of the things that you're seeing on the streets of Ukraine is politics by other means, where people who have not been able to weigh in on leadership choices, and some of Zelensky's choices are now weighing in. But there is, it's not an unusual situation in war that there are different methods and theories, and there are ups and downs, and those become personnel issues. But I think that there's also a certain amount of management that Zelensky is involved in of potential political rivals and others, and the Ukrainian population is pushing back in that respect. So nothing of this is suggesting that Zelensky is weakening or about to fall. This is in some respects typical wartime back and forth, but it's increasingly difficult for Zelensky to manage. You see the strains of the war on both sides of the battlefield.
Right. And so how much discontent is there inside Ukraine about the way President Zelensky is leading the country against Russia's invasion?
I think in the very big picture sense, things are fine for Zelensky. He's understood to be a person of personal courage and a good communicator on the global stage, and he's, sort of taken Ukraine through some very, very difficult and dark years. But Zelensky has slightly authoritarian, or at the very least, sort of strong tendencies when it comes to government, and the war has enhanced those tendencies up to a point. And I think that there's a shot across the bow here from the Ukrainian population that Zelensky commands enormous power, but not unlimited power.
Good talking to you. Thanks for joining us, Michael. Michael Kimmage from the Kennan Institute.
Thank you for having me.
And our correspondent Nick Connolly joins me now from Kyiv. Nick, 400 Ukrainian drones raining down on the greater Moscow region. What makes this attack different from what we have seen before?
I think, Brent, what really matters here is the geography. This is the Moscow region, the part of Russia that is meant to be best defended, and you're seeing these drones getting through nonetheless. Okay, this is not Red Square, this is still, the Moscow region, but still this is not very far away from the city limits, and some of these places are even, considered part of Moscow, so that is very, very embarrassing for Russia's air defences, given also we've seen reports in recent weeks of air defence systems being taken away, redeployed from the rest of the country to protect Moscow, and yet they're still having that effect. And then in terms of some of the targets we've been seeing in recent days is Wildberries. That's maybe a company that's not familiar to people outside Russia, but it's basically Russia's equivalent of Amazon. So it is the big dominant online retailer. And so you're seeing people in a kind of very unexpected way suddenly being confronted with these attacks because their order of a hair product or something else is not arriving because the warehouse has burnt down. Now the Ukrainians say those warehouses also ship a lot of stuff that is dual use that's also important on the front lines, but that's certainly something hits people on a very different level than the kind of big oil facilities.
Yes, it's a good point you bring up, and I'm wondering, is this a war of attrition in which Ukraine is trying to hit Russia's economy now just as much as it's trying to hit its military?
I mean, Brent, if you speak to lots of military experts here and former officers, they'll say there isn't a difference between Russia's economy and its army. It is the same thing. The army can only carry on occupying more and more of Ukraine because there's the money and the logistics to keep it going. So they kind of would say that's probably a false dichotomy dividing that. In terms, obviously, the oil facilities, right, that is a very easy target in terms of flammability, right? You don't need a huge warhead. If something is full of crude oil, if you get there, if you hit the right piece of kit, then you are going to create a huge fire and probably destroy some equipment that was made by Western companies that Russia can't replace during the current sanctions regime without huge difficulty. So that is kind of also uniquely worthwhile in terms of the investment of what that drone costs versus the damage it does to Russia. And I think we're seeing two different kinds of strikes. We're seeing the kind of deep strikes like on those oil facilities, and then the middle strikes, which are maybe kind of 100, 200 kilometers maximum deep into Russia or occupied Ukraine, where Ukraine is now trying to stop basically any logistics getting to the front lines, deprive those Russian positions of fuel, of ammunition, of anything basically they need to keep going. And they're trying to put the front lines into what they're calling a kind of logistical lockdown to make sure that they can't advance here on the battlefield in Ukraine.
Nick, this attack comes just after Russia's massive missile assault on Kyiv. Is it trying to impose a cost on ordinary Russians to show that Moscow is no longer insulated from this war?
I think certainly Ukraine is not able and doesn't want to cause the same kind of civilian loss of life that we've seen Russia do time and time again here in Ukraine in terms of missiles hitting residential buildings and entire kind of neighborhoods of extended families, neighbors being wiped out. That's something we see here in Kyiv routinely, and Russia seemingly in no mood to kind of change the tactics, but it just keeps on happening. I think Ukraine is obviously a lot more dependent on the goodwill of the outside world, of the Western world, that wouldn't countenance that kind of civilian loss of life. But certainly these attacks, and even if it's just kind of sleepless nights because of air alerts, because of drones flying over, that is something that I think lots of Russians were not expecting to be confronted with. They thought this was a kind of contained colonial war happening to other people somewhere else far away that wouldn't kind of come back and bite them. So there's certainly that. And if you look on Ukrainian social media, lots of people are sharing videos of people in the Moscow region complaining about the noise of the drones flying over, the shooting to try and intercept them, being exhausted. And lots of Ukrainians obviously saying that is exactly what we've been living with for the last 4 and a bit years. Did you really think that this would never come back, and that this couldn't be sent back to its originator?
If we could, let's focus on where you are. Last week there were major protests in Kyiv against President Zelensky's decision to fire the defense minister, and we have to say this was a very popular defense minister. Those protests, they continue. How do they and this latest major drone attack on Moscow, how do they fit together?
Well, certainly, Mykhailo Fedorov, the minister who lost his job in that very unexpected reshuffle, was crucial in terms of sending resources, redirecting resources in Ukraine's military budget towards exactly those kind of drone strikes and taking away money from conventional weaponry. We've had stories doing the rounds recently about the Ukrainian generals being angry that not enough money was going into artillery and too much into these drone strikes. So there's a real worry that now that he's gone, and soon it's expected that his team will also be kind of pushed out, as is conventional normal here in Ukraine. When a new minister comes, basically everyone loses their job. That basically that kind of institutional memory and the teams that made that possible will not continue, and that maybe for now the technology that's in place will continue working. But we've seen it time and time again during this war, this kind of cat and mouse game, that after a couple of months each side gets used to the new technology presented by its opponent and comes up with a solution. So will Ukraine next time around come up with a new iteration of long distance drones that can cause this kind of damage? That is a real worry here. And there's a sense that Mykhailo Fedorov is basically the only one in the Zelensky team who had a kind of vision that he was talking about how, if not to win this war, but at least to end it on Ukraine's terms, how really to impose a cost on Russia. Whereas from the generals like Syrskyi, the head of the top general in the army, and from Zelensky, there's lots of just carrying on, holding on for bitter life at the front lines, but not really a kind of optimistic kind of technological explanation of how Ukraine with smaller resources is going to stand up to Russia with many more people and a lot more cash.
Nick, let me ask you before we run out of time, what is the message being sent to Ukraine's allies at the moment? I mean, you've got massive drone attacks on Russia, ongoing protests inside Ukraine against Zelensky's leadership vis-a-vis this war. I mean, what's the message there?
Brent, I'm not sure that the government right now has the energy or the kind of wherewithal to have one single message and to kind of push that consistently. I think they've got lots of kind of crisis management and constantly just kind of responding to things being thrown at them. And I think that is totally normal in a war situation, given the kind of discrepancy in resources between Ukraine, in spite of all the Western help it gets, and Russia. But I think in terms of the protests, I think that is just proof that this is a vibrant democracy. For all the kind of willingness to put difficulties and internal political rivalries aside during the war, when Zelensky and his team cross a line that people here are not willing to accept, they go out into the street. They did it last year when there was a danger, a kind of threat to the anti-corruption institutions that have been created here, and now again they're doing it. There's another protest tonight, and then there's another one expected at the end of the week if they don't get what they're demanding in terms of Syrskyi getting kicked out, and other reforms in terms of carrying on that technological change. So I think this is just a country where people, don't want to rock the boat, but are willing to challenge the government if they think that it's taking the wrong decision.
DW's Nick Connolly with the latest from Kyiv tonight. Nick, as always, thank you.